So welcome to another episode of Beyond Perception, where it's about discovering reality beyond our limited perception and waking up to our human nature, our true self, and to our connectedness with our life. I'm Simon, and I have the true pleasure to be here today with David Godman. David, you have extensively written on the life teachings and disciples of Ramana Maharshi, an Indian sage who lived and taught for more than 50 years at Arunachala, a sacred mountain in Tamil Nadu, India. And from what I know, you have first visited the Tiruvannamalai, I hope I pronounced it accurately, probably not, ashram of Ramana Maharshi in 1976. And for 8 years, you were the librarian of the ashram. And in the last 30 years, you have written or edited 16 books on topics related to Sri Ramana, his teachings and his followers. And yeah, it's a true pleasure to speak today here with you. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
And I want to share just a little bit of context before we start the conversation, how I bumped into basically you. A few weeks ago, I encountered Ramana Maharshi and his teachings through your book, Be As You Are, which had a profound impact. It changed my perception and perspective on many things, on everything, and experience beyond just the words came alive, and it was like seeing the world through different eyes. Was very remarkable, and I'm still processing what happened, and I'm integrating that. And yeah, also therefore, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So thank you again.
May I say that you're not the first person, that there's something about the power of his words that touches people, makes them quiet, and in a very subtle way, immediately transforms their worldview. What they previously took to be normal and real suddenly evaporated and was replaced by an entirely new perception on what was true about themselves and what was true about the world. It's quite a standard reaction to being exposed to his words. There's a power in those words simply because he himself experienced the truth of those words. And even though he passed away in 1950, the power of those words, when you read something he's said himself, still has the power to show you what he's talking about.
Yeah, I can confirm to that. It was both, like it was beautiful, it was confusing, it was everything. It challenged my whole identity and how I perceived myself, and also what I thought is true. And it was like seeing through a lot of things and seeing the illusion in it, to like describe it with my limited words. And I introduced you before, and I provided a context, and you are the author of the book Be As You Are, which I read and which enabled me to open up that experience. And so you are deeply familiar with the teachings of Ramana Maharshi, and would you mind briefly to share with our audience who Ramana was and why he was considered the most important Indian saint of the 20th century?
Okay, that's a long story. He was born late 19th century in a small South Indian town, and had a spontaneous Enlightenment experience at the age of 16, primarily a consequence of asking himself, or finding the question being asked inside himself, who is the one who sees, who is the internal perceiver of things which are imagined to be outside. So somehow he had a very strong feeling that he was about to die, and his response to this wasn't to go and see a doctor or run away from it. He wanted to know what it was inside himself was going to die, and what would survive the death of the body. So for him, it presented a challenge rather than something to run away from. So he said he found himself lying down on the floor, looking internally at what it was inside himself that might or might not survive the destruction of the body. So he was asking himself, what is this I which thinks itself to be Venkataraman? That was his original name. And he said, as I looked at it, it disappeared, leaving what he called the ground, the substratum of truth, of reality, which was indestructible. So he knew in that moment that whether the body died or not made no difference to him, because he wasn't the body, he wasn't tied to it or associated with it. There was something utterly transcendent to that underlay, that substratum, which he knew himself to be. So whether the body survived or not was irrelevant. He'd found out who he was, and he'd found out that the idea that he was something else was intimately attached to this notion of being an I in an individual body. He said that's what he lost in that moment. He no longer regarded himself as being an individual person who functioned from inside the body. He knew himself to be what the Indians call Brahman or Atman, the substratum out of which all other things manifest, including the mind and the idea of the individual self. So why does he have such a good reputation? Probably two strands to that. He was a very saintly man. I think gurus tend to come in all shapes and sizes, and quite a lot of them have dubious characters or personalities. There was something extraordinarily saintly, upfront, honest about him. He had no possessions, he had no relationships. His life was an open book. People could come to see him wherever he was. His door was always open. Nobody was ever turned away. And people found, simply by being in proximity with him, that their minds tended to slow down and stop. So he didn't have to teach them anything. He didn't have to convince them of anything, or in most cases, the conviction arose simply because they'd sat in his presence, and something in that proximity caused them also to become temporarily, at least, quiet in the way that he was. So I think there's a lot of people who came to him, had massive transformations, and I think collectively that's the reason why he has such a good reputation. But it doesn't help that he was an altogether saintly man who never touched money, never had any scandals associated with him. And I think his reputation today is probably as high as it ever was during his lifetime, and is probably growing.
Yeah, so you just described how did he describe through words, if he did, the experience of the self-realization. That was something he experienced himself at a young age, right?
It happened to him when he was 16 years old.
Yeah.
It came without any prior interest or practice. He simply solved the problem inside himself of what is this thing that I've been calling I inside myself? How did it originate? How did it come to occupy my body and pretend it lived there and was a real permanent entity? He looked at this thing. In later years, he said, this is just an idea. It's a squatter who takes up residence in your house, and simply by never being looked at, never being challenged, everybody assumes it has a right to be there. So he said, I looked at the squatter. I said, who are you? What are you doing in my house? And I saw that fundamentally, it wasn't a real thing. It was something that I'd imposed on myself. It was an active imagination that caused this thing called I to come into existence. And when I traced it back to its origin and saw it disappear definitively, after that, this thing called I, as an individual I, never functioned in me again.
And yeah, Ramana said, or there's this quote of Ramana where he says, no effort is required to realize the omnipresent self. In fact, it has always been realized. Only the illusion of the I thought has to be overcome in order to realize this. So
this is the paradox, that being the self requires no effort, because that's what you always are and always have been. What does require an effort is to give up all the conditioning which makes you believe something else. So he wasn't a fan of no effort in spiritual practice. He said self itself is effortlessness. Once you reach that state, then you don't need to sustain it by effort, because it's not something that's attained by effort or lost by lack of effort. But he says you do need to put, or most people need to put in a lot of work to understand this entity that they've superimposed on the self, which is running their life for them. He said you need constantly to challenge its right to exist. You have to look at it, stop it connecting with all the things it wants to play with, make it go back into the self and disappear. So the effort is not in being the self or realizing the self. He said self is always realized. The effort is to drag your attention away from all the things that make you believe it's not your true nature.
And like my perspective on that, with just my subjective perception, is that like from the ego, it seems so overwhelming and there's so much to do, but if you actually like get that other perspective, like you start like laughing, because there was nothing between you and the self. And like I remember that, I think it is in the book, that somewhere he describes it at like once you wake up, you're just laughing because they're like you just kept yourself imprisoned in something which was not there in the first hand. So that's like just my
It's a bit like waking up in the morning. You live in a dream world. In that dream world, you've projected a landscape, you've created other characters in that dream world, you've bought into the reality of that dream world, you've interacted with all these dream characters, and they may be doing the most ridiculous, improbable things, and then you open your eyes and you just laugh and think, how could I possibly have believed all that nonsense? I mean, why did I buy into that? So that's the equivalent of the moment of enlightenment. It's the knowledge that everything you thought about yourself, your relationships with other people, the whole landscape you created and populated with these people, it vaporizes instantly once you eradicate the dreamer of the world, if you like. So that's what Bhagavan is saying. He says in a very real sense, we are also creating a superimposition, something that isn't true, putting it on top of what is true, and we're living in this self-created landscape, suffering, desiring, wanting things, without really understanding that the whole thing is a self-created superimposition. And he said, when you take away the I, which does the projection, and that I vanishes in its source, the whole projection goes along with it. And in a sense, you metaphorically open your eyes, you laugh and you say, this is it. And then you understand, not only is it, it's what I always was. This was here all the time, but I didn't notice it because my attention was extroverted onto other things.
And did he recommend any practices or to develop certain character qualities in order to realize the self?
Absolutely not. He said anybody can undertake this practice called self-inquiry. The primary precondition is not a sense of moral virtue or any prior training with any other antecedent practices. He said if you have a desire to succeed, if you have a hunger for transcendence, if it's something that you feel an affinity with, if it's something you want to succeed at, then you're qualified to do it. He said, don't put it off by thinking that you have to be qualified to start. The best way to do self-inquiry properly is to start off doing it badly and get better. In the same way that you learn a piano, you're very bad on day one, and after a year, you're a bit better. He said, start doing it. Nothing else prepares you for it. Just start doing it. Sooner or later, you'll get the hang of it. It will become easier, and you'll start to experience the peace and stability that comes from an attenuated mind.
And if you were to describe the method of self-inquiry, like, what's that about? What does that?
Okay, I need to give you a little theoretical background, otherwise it won't make a lot of sense. So his primary assumption, if you like, or what he said was the most important thing you need to understand about your own individuality, your own sense of I, is this thing that you call I inside yourself can only continue to exist if it associates with something else, such as a thought or a desire or a feeling, or some identification. I am a man, lawyer, I am angry, I see the door across the room. So it's this constant collecting of information from thoughts, perceptions, feelings, ideas, and all these data inputs arrive, and something inside you says, I am feeling this, I am noticing this, I am thinking this, I am remembering this. So he said the two things joined together create a sense of continuity for the internal I inside yourself. So he said this gives you an opportunity to eradicate this internal I. He said if you cut off all the food that it feeds on, stop it associating with or identifying with all the apparently external things it wants to play with, your thoughts, your perceptions, your feelings, and put attention instead back on this sense of I that exists inside yourself. So now I've just explained that the I can't exist without reaching out to grab something to say, this is my thought, this is my identity. He said each time inside yourself that you recollect that you've had a thought or a memory or an idea or a feeling, he said, take attention off it, because that thought, that perception, that feeling is an object, and the object has appeared to a subject, and that subject is I. So he said, put attention on this thing called I inside yourself, which is collecting all this information and pretending it's the experiencer and recorder of it. And he said, every time your mind runs away, which it will do almost immediately, grab onto the next thing, just say, no, that's just an object that's come up in my mind or in my field of perception. I am not the object, I am the perceiver, I am the subject who sees it. Who am I? What is this thing called I inside myself that continually collects all these inputs and then says that they're mine? I am the I who experiences them all. So he said, as you continually put attention on this inner sense of I and deprive it of all the things it needs to stay alive, he says you'll notice it slowly subsiding back into itself. And when you've completely deprived it of all nourishment, all food, it goes back into its source and disappears. And he said at that point you recognize the true self from which all these wrong ideas emanated.
And from that perspective, then there's also only karma if I believe.
Only what?
Karma, or there's only something to fix, to resolve if I believe there is.
So he said ideas about karma, they arise only in relationship to this thing called I, which you imagine yourself to be. He said there's no karma in the self, Brahman, Atman. He said karma is something that comes into being once you've misidentified yourself as a person who lives in a body. He said, once you think I am the doer, I am the performer of actions, then this thing called karma starts sticking to you, and there are consequences to your actions. But when you eradicate completely, definitively, the idea I am the doer inside this body, then there's no karma. Karma is permanently eradicated.
And then one illusionary identification. Illusionary identification would also be to identify as a soul, right? Not just the body, but also the soul from this perspective is also just a way of identifying yourself, right?
When you identify as yourself, almost invariably you're talking about something that you locate inside a human form. You don't say, I am that mountain over there. You say, I am the person who lives inside this 1 meter 80 frame, and I function from inside this frame, pulling the levers, pressing the buttons, or organizing the apparent existence of this person who lives inside the body. He said, once that goes, there's a true knowledge of who you are, and that knowledge, surprisingly, isn't confined to a body or restricted to it. There's a knowledge of an immanent transcendent self in which all bodies will appear and disappear, in which all manifestation will appear and disappear. You no longer localize yourself to a particular form and say, this is me, I live inside this body.
And that includes also the soul body, right?
The soul is, I'm not sure what you mean by that, but if it's an individual in any form, then it disappears. There is no individuality in this state. He says individuality is just the wrong idea.
Okay, thank you very much for clarifying this. And I'm aware, you're writing about this, that he had different teaching styles depending on the progress of the devotee. Could you explain his way of teaching the different styles? How did he lead his devotees to realize the self?
He wasn't a one-size-fits-all teacher. He recognized that people were at different levels of maturity and also had different inclinations. Some people are attracted to one kind of practice, some people are attracted to others. In general, he always said that my primary, highest principal teachings is the silence that comes off me when I just sit here being quiet. So he recognized that there was a direct heart-to-heart transmission, if you like, that when people came to sit with him and quietened their minds, then his state was able to communicate with those minds and pull them back into their own source. So this was a non-verbal teaching. It was a non-verbal transmission. He said, to whatever extent you can be quiet, either in my presence or even just thinking of me, to that extent, then the power of this self inside yourself will reveal itself to you. So he always said, this is my teaching, my primary teaching. I say is only for people who can't tune into this fundamental silent transmission. So then once you go down a little bit from that, you come to a level where he simply tells you who you are. So that this is the classic way that Indian masters historically have revealed the truth to their advanced devotees. He simply tells you, you are Brahman, you are the self, you're not the person you imagine yourself to be. And in a few rare cases, just having this knowledge, receiving this piece of information is enough to shock you out of your restricted sense of individuality and put you in this state that he's talking about. So level one is simply being himself, being inside you as the self inside you and pulling you in through his silent presence. Number two, he'll just say, this is who you are. You are the self, you are Brahman, be this. So there's no question of practice at this particular level. There's just, I'm telling you who you are. Stop pretending to be who you're not. This is who you are. And in a few cases, that would actually work. The vast majority of people would say, well, yes, but what do I do? This is the classic, I haven't got the experience that you've told me should be my experience. Therefore, I want to do something about it to try and get that experience. So at that point, then he might tell you to do self-inquiry, which is the practice I just outlined, or he might tell you to do unconditional surrender to the higher power. He said there are only two effective ways of realizing the self. Either you inquire who is the I, who imagines he or she lives inside the body, or you surrender that sense of I, this wrong sense of individuality, to the higher power, and let it dissolve in that higher power. He said, ultimately, you have to do one or the other, and that all other methods or practices are like tributary streams. Sooner or later, they have to join one of those two big rivers, and one of those two big rivers will eventually discharge into the ocean of the self. So he would advocate self-inquiry as the most direct method, but he also conceded that some people didn't like it, didn't want to do it, and they were more inclined to devotional practices. So he would never impose any of his beliefs or practices on other people. He was entirely non-prescriptive. If you didn't feel that you wanted to do it, then he would say, fine, repeat God's name, he would just find something you were comfortable with and recommend that you carry on doing that. So he didn't insist that everyone follow a particular teaching. In fact, he never gave advice to people unless he was asked. So he wasn't a preacher in the sense that he had a message for the whole world or for anyone in particular. He just sat there quietly being himself. And if people couldn't tune into his silent emanations, if they couldn't accept the truth of who they were, because after he told them who they were, then he would say, well, do this practice called self-inquiry. I can tell you it's the most direct, the most effective way of getting back to the self. If that doesn't appeal to you, then you can do some form of bhakti, some form of traditional devotional worship. They're all heading in the same direction. But he never looked down on people who didn't like to follow self-inquiry. He just let people do whatever they wanted to.
As you said before, just by being in his presence enabled devotees to realize the self. So there were spontaneous self-realizations in his presence.
Very, very few, but they did happen. I mean, you have to realize that he taught for over 50 years. Thousands and thousands of people came to see him. And the number of people who sat there and actually got it directly and definitively in his presence is, small single figures, but it did happen. Everybody else had to sit there for a long time, do a lot of practice, or they didn't get it even after a long practice. So the full realization was very, very rare, but I think his teachings, in a sense, were validated by the success stories, that those people who did get it from him, through him, are proof that his own realization was genuine, and that he had the capacity to show the self to other people.
And how did these self-realizations manifest or express themselves?
I think everybody reacts to it a little differently. Papaji, he didn't even tell his wife. He went home and went back to his job in Chennai. I mean, obviously it was a big deal for him, but he didn't feel he had to share it with anyone or tell anyone. He just carried on life as normal. One of the teachers I was with, Lakshmana Swami, he stopped speaking. I asked him about this, and he said, from the moment I first met Bhagavan and had this experience, he said, I didn't say another word for 13 years. And I said, why not? He said, because there was nothing I could say that could adequately convey what had happened to me. So I just thought I'll keep quiet. So everybody, or not everyone, each person seems to have a different, very specific reaction to the event. What they all do say is there's absolutely nothing you can say about it that's true or in any way communicates what's happened. It's something beyond the mind, it's non-verbal. If you've got it, you know it, and if you haven't got it, it can't be explained to you.
So you cannot really describe how life after self-realization will be like.
You can do it indirectly. I mean, they will all say, oh, it's peace, it's silence, it's happiness, it's bliss. There are characteristics of it, that are quite interesting. You have completely lost the sense that you're the agent of anything the body does. All of these people say that everything they say and everything that the body does is not brought about by choice. They don't choose to do things, they don't choose to say things, they don't ever feel that they're the agent for the actions that the body performs. They say some power makes me say the things I say, some power makes me do the things I do, but there's nobody inside me that chooses or desires what to do next. All these things happen spontaneously. There's no feeling that anything needs to be done. And if things are done, there's never a sense that one is the agent of their doing.
Yeah. From what I understand, Ramana also speaks of different truths. So there's relative truth and an absolute truth. And I found this quote: there's neither creation nor destruction, neither destiny nor free will, neither path nor achievement. This is the final truth. Could you share your perspective on that? When I heard that initially, it was a bit...
Is that the verse that got you?
That was very hard to write. Like it didn't make any sense. And it was so, like, fuck. No, I want my free will.
I definitely said there's no free will. Whichever level of the teaching you want to talk to him at, he would never concede free will. But the particular verse you just read out comes from a very famous Indian saint philosopher from about 1200 years ago. And the teachings in that particular verse are labeled Ajata Vada. Ajata means no creation. And it quite literally means that there was never anybody who experienced ignorance, that the manifest world never did come into existence, even as an act of imagination. And because there are no people in the world, no one is struggling to attain liberation and nobody is attaining it. This is the final truth. The word in Sanskrit is paramata, and that's taken to mean the highest possible experience of truth is that nothing has ever happened because there's nobody to whom anything is happening. So Bhagavan said, this is my experience, and it's the experience of all people who have realized the self, but it's not something that you can explain. Saying this repeatedly isn't going to help people because it doesn't give them, if you like, a point of contact with their own sense of ignorance. It doesn't give them a key to the exit door. He said people have locked themselves up in these imaginary rooms. You have to tell them where the door is. You have to give them the key. You have to show them the way out. Saying that they don't exist and haven't ever existed isn't fundamentally going to help them. You have to come down to their level and give them something practical they can do to eliminate the wrong ideas they have about themselves that prevent themselves from experiencing the self. So this Ajata stance, he said, this is my experience, it's the experience of all jnanis, all liberated beings, but I can't keep saying that all day. I have to give you something useful, something practical to help you to escape from the wrong ideas you have about yourself. So that's when you start going down the levels. That's when he starts to tell you who you are. That's when he concedes temporarily that there might be a world out there that you're functioning in. And he tells you that you're not the person inside the body who appears to be functioning in this world. And he tells you, as a working hypothesis, this is who you imagine yourself to be. I'm telling you you're not this person. I'm going to give you a very simple, practical method that, if you follow it, will get you out of all the wrong ideas that you've imposed on yourself. Trust me, it works. I did it myself. If you follow this method, then you too can completely eliminate all these imaginary ideas you have about yourself. And finally, when your sense of being an individual completely ends, then you'll come into this state. You'll come into this ajata state, you'll laugh and say, yes, now I understand. But you don't get to that state by having someone like him simply tell it to you. Yeah. So he said, although that is my experience, that is my state, it's not a helpful state to keep telling people, because it doesn't give them anything useful to transcend their notion of limitedness.
And what my ego was wondering, who is striving for self-realization? Is that my ego who is actually wanting or desiring to realize the self? Like, if the self is always there and the ego is an illusion, like, who wants self-realization then?
But Bhagavan said you've got to have the right attitude when you do this practice. You're not trying to get something that you haven't already got. He said if you start with that attitude, then you have an ego that's looking for the next experience to add to all its other experiences. He said the best, in India they call it the bhavana, the correct perspective, the correct attitude to have when you start the practice isn't, I must attain this state, because that presupposes, it assumes that there is an I already in existence that needs to do something to reach some other state which it's currently not in. He said you have to start from the fundamental notion that there isn't an individual self. He said have that as your starting belief, your starting conviction, and then you do the practice. So the practice is not aimed at reaching or attaining some greater wonderful experience. The aim of the practice is to fully experience the non-existence of the I that you previously imagined yourself to be. He said, don't start from the idea that there is an I, that you have to fight it, or you have to use this I to reach something or attain a great state. He said, I'm telling you, this I doesn't exist, it's not real, it's causing you all your problems. Start from that assumption, and I will tell you how to stop it having this stranglehold over you.
And did you recommend to meditate, or do you have to meditate to reach certain states of consciousness? I believe you also wrote about different samadhis, different states of consciousness, which you have to pass through on the way to self-realization, or is that something completely different?
The idea of all these different samadhis, they exist in various Indian texts, but he would explain them to people who are interested, but he never said you had to go through them yourself. So he had this phrase called sahaja samadhi. He said sahaja means natural. He said your true natural state is the truth. He said samadhi, he defined samadhi as being experiencing reality as it is. He said that's samadhi. So you can have it in a kind of internal trance state, that's nirvikalpa samadhi. But he said that it doesn't do you any good. Your desires haven't been extinguished. It's just a temporary state of absence of mind in which you're not aware of anything outside of yourself. These are the traditional samadhis that the yogis aspire for. He said you don't need to progress from one to the next to the next. He said go straight for the sahaja, the natural state, and the way to do it is through inquiry. You don't have to subject yourself to levels or grades or hierarchies. He said there's only one true state. You're in it right now. What's stopping you from recognizing this is your notion that you're a person who lives in a body. I will give you this practice called self-inquiry that will help you to eradicate the wrong idea that you live in the body. You don't have to deal with all these other samadhis. They're just a detour. And he said there is only one consciousness. He said there are not levels of consciousness. You don't graduate from simpler ones to higher ones to even more higher ones. He said consciousness is as it is. It's what you truly are. What you're not is this person that you take to be yourself. And when you give up that idea of being a person, all that remains is consciousness. And there's no higher or lower consciousness. There just is consciousness. That's what you are. And when you stop thinking, I have body consciousness, I have self-consciousness, all of these are additions to the basic underlay of consciousness. Give up the idea that there is some kind of consciousness, like an I consciousness or a body consciousness. He said, give all that up, and what remains is the one and only consciousness.
Thank you for sharing this, because that created some confusion for me, because in those weeks I referred to, which led me to having this conversation with you, there was this realization that chakras, that different states of consciousness, that's an illusion, that doesn't exist. But that was something I have been practicing for a while, and which was very helpful to me in my own development, and extremely valuable, helpful. And then suddenly there was this realization, it doesn't exist, and it was very confusing. So when you're sharing this now, that adds a very valuable perspective on.
So what he would say is that all of these practices can produce experiences. They might be very peaceful, happy, blissful, visionary experiences, but they haven't transcended the experiencer. They're experiences that occur to an experiencer. He says what self-inquiry does is eradicate the experiencer so that no experiencing can ever be possible again.
And we had a brief conversation before this conversation, and we exchanged some quotes. And another one I would love to citate is, the thinking mind and the I thought are one and the same. The thinking mind is an illusion. You already spoke about what is reality or what is illusion. And maybe you could add on that a little bit. How did he define the mind? What was reality to him?
Okay, so it's most definitely not mind. So he was, how shall we say, a syncretist. He didn't go for lots and lots of little subdivisions and have very carefully tailored distinctions between all these psychological phenomenon. He would say that mind, fundamentally, he would either say it's just a bundle of thoughts, or he would equate it with the I thought. The I thought is that which rises inside yourself and says, I live here, these are my thoughts, these are my feeling. So he said that is mind. Mind and I thought are essentially the same phenomenon. And he said neither of them is the reality, neither of them is the truth. Mind and I thought are superimpositions on what's real, and that you can get rid of both and you can live very happily without both. So when I say that mind is a bundle of thoughts, it's more accurate to say that it's the thinker of those thoughts. He said that your problem is not thoughts in themselves. He said there's nothing wrong with thoughts. Thoughts are going to happen. The problem is I am thinking these thoughts. So this is the I thought. The coordinator inside yourself that takes hold of all these thoughts and says, I am the person having these thoughts, is what you have to get rid of. So he said all of your problems come from identifying with this I inside yourself that collects thoughts, imagines it's experiencing them, and then it has to choose or decide what to do next. Once you buy into this notion that there's an I in there who thinks, chooses, and decides, then you have to start protecting this entity inside yourself that you've created. You have to constantly, on a moment-to-moment basis, choose and decide what to do next, because you've invented this thing inside yourself that you need to protect and nourish and look after. He said, this is not necessary at all. Let thoughts be there. They're not going to bother you until the point comes when you said, I am thinking this thought. I'm making this decision. I am choosing what to do next. He said, it's this I thought that's your problem, not the thoughts themselves.
So thinking is not going to stop after self-realization. It's just
thoughts. Thoughts will be there, but there won't be a thinker of them. So he seemed to have thoughts. For example, he would be sitting in his hall and somebody would walk in and he would say, oh, I was just thinking of you and you turned up. So obviously something's going on in his head, but what's not going on in his head is an I thinking, I live here, I am collecting thoughts, I am responding to them.
And from that perspective, everything is a construct of the thought, right? Like
Yeah.
our body, this world, everything. So this all is in like the absolute truth would be
Everything you see, think, believe is thought. Once you've decided that you're this person who lives in a body, then he said that the natural consequence of that is you create a world that's actually made out of your thoughts in a way that there's no reality to it. It's all an imaginary superimposition on what's true and what's real, and it's all comprised of thought. It's all made of thought. He said when the thinker of those thoughts, the experiencer of the experience goes, then it's like the whole slate of differentiation, separation, everything just gets wiped out, and there's nothing left except Brahman, the self, the substratum.
and once you realize or you discover this illusion or you realize the self, what then can be or can be the purpose of existence, or what would, like, if you realize that this is a creation of the mind, is there still right and wrong? Is there some ethical framework you should strive to live your life by, or will you automatically just like be by surrendering to the self, leading an ethical life, or is that not a consideration at all?
The jnanis would say that you can't choose to do or not do in that state. You can't choose to think, should I do this? Is this right? Is this wrong? He said that's part of the mechanism that's an outgrowth of an individual I. So the kind of ethical problems that you have as an individual person can't exist once that individual person has ceased to exist. What they do say is that once you get taken over by this current, this self, then everything you do is a manifestation of that self. Everything is good, everything is done well, everything is done properly, but it's not done with any choices. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? So you can't strive to live an ethical life after this realization, because there's nobody left who can make fundamental choices about rightness and wrongness or what to do next. It's all taken over and run by the higher power.
Which is the self.
Which is the self, yeah.
And did he believe everyone who wanted could realize the self in this lifetime, or is this something which...
in this lifetime, probably not. He did say that everyone ultimately is destined for self-realization. He took a longer view. He said it's going to happen maybe over many lifetimes, but he said ultimately it's the destiny of everyone to go back to the self and extinguish their idea of individuality there, and at which point there will be self-realization. I don't think he would have said it's possible for anyone in a particular life to do it, but he did concede that sooner or later that was everyone's destiny.
And from that higher truth, that absolute truth, that there is no free will, that basically is the reflection of that sooner or later everybody like will come back to where
I'll qualify this a little bit. He
Okay.
said we always have the choice not to identify with the body that's performing action, the mind that's thinking thoughts. He said that's your one true freedom. He said moment to moment, you can acknowledge or recognize that you're not the person who lives in the body. Don't buy into that idea. He said that's always your choice. In fact, he said it's the one true freedom you have. He said all other freedoms are no choices at all, but you always do have the choice to not identify with the body which is performing its actions.
Okay. And if that's the right word at all, compare his teaching to other Advaita teachers such as Papaji or Nisargadatta Maharaj? Was it very different? Was it similar? How did you experience differences?
I think they all had the capacity to show you who you were when you were exposed to them. So you sit with these people. Some of them are quiet, they just look at you. Some of them argue with you. Some, like Papaji, was a householder. He had an ordinary suburban life to some extent. Lakshmana Swami, he was a complete recluse. He hardly ever saw anybody. That they all have different characters, personalities, but what they all share is an absolute unshakable knowledge of who they are, and that knowledge is capable of communication to people in their vicinity or to people who practice their teachings. So I think that there are differences of vocabulary, there are differences in the way they directed people towards this truth, but they were all functioning from this state of truth. They all had, how shall we say, the best interests of everybody in reaching that truth. And although the vocabulary and the teachings varied slightly, they were that truth and they were pushing everybody into it.
And would you say that depending on one as an individual stance, different teacher, different style of teaching would resonate more or enable one to get the truth behind the teaching more easily than maybe with another teacher?
Probably. I think everybody has a destined teacher, and often when you show up, you instantly recognize a connection with that particular teacher. Something happens. It's not that some people are more ready, more mature, and that the mature ones get the experience and the immature ones don't. I think if you find yourself in the presence of a true teacher who is your true teacher, not a true teacher in general, then there's this impact, this moment of recognition. You get a sense of silence. It's almost like an initiation. It's like you've come home, you found the right teacher, you're in the right place, and those teachings are going to work on you, resonate with you better than they are on someone who might be in the same state as you, but is destined to be with a different teacher.
Dear David, thank you so much for this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, feel free to share this or not. What I would be very curious to just hear a little bit of your own experiences. How did your life change over the course of these decades, like being exposed to all these great teachers and teachings, and if that's something you would feel free to share, but if not, that's also totally.
I'm not sure if I can answer that, because
okay.
I'm on the inside, if you like. I don't find it possible to judge all these things. Lakshmana Swami, I told you about, he said only the teacher can see what state the devotee is in. The devotee lacks the apparatus, the equipment to make any judgment about how near or how close he is to realization, how whether they have the capacity to reach that state, whether they've done much to attain that state, whether they're making good progress. He said this is something that's very easy to see if you're in that state, but if you're inside a mind and still trying to get yourself out of a mind, then you have zero capacity to make an effective evaluation of what state you're in and how long it's going to be before you get out of it. So I could tell you all kinds of stories about how I think I've evolved and how much progress I've made and all the great experiences I've had with all these great teachers. But they're just my stories. and I can't give you a definitive, yes, I've made this much progress or that much progress. I'm very content. I will say that. I have great respect for all of the teachers I've been with. I have great respect for them showing me who I am, briefly, temporarily. They have validated their teachings with me by moments when I've sat with them and they've shown me who I am. It never stuck, but there's something in those experiences that for me validates their claims about themselves and the teachings that they give out. So I will say I have experienced firsthand the essence of what these teachers are saying and the essence of what they're being, but I can't say that it's permanent or it's stuck. But I will say I'm very happy and I'm very content.
Thank you very much for sharing this with us. I don't know, do you have a last word to the audience, something you feel compelled to share about something?
No.
Okay.
I think I've said enough.
Well, yeah, thank you, David, again, for your time, for sharing your experiences, and also, yeah, sharing about the teachings of Ramana. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Yeah, and also thank you to the audience. Thank you very much for being with us, and yeah, see you next time. Thank you very much.